Hello and welcome to the Arctic Institute's first webinar of 2025. My name is Victoria Herrmann, and I am a senior fellow at the Arctic Institute. And I have the absolute pleasure today of moderating a robust discussion with three awe-inspiring researchers at the Arctic Institute who will have a conversation about where we find ourselves in 2025. The Arctic has been in the news over the last 2 months, more so than it has been over the last 12 months, in a variety of ways, in politics, in policy, in power, and in economy. And in all of this, I thought it would be interesting to open the floor every month to Arctic Institute colleagues, to friends of the Arctic Institute, and to our partners in informal hour-long discussions about where we are, where we are going as a region, and the different perspectives researchers have from diverse geographies and disciplines into this polar moment. Today, we are kicking off that conversation with three of our researchers at the Arctic Institute, including our president and managing director. I will introduce them shortly and hand over the virtual mic so that they can offer their positionality in this discussion, what their background is, where they are zooming in from, and what they are thinking about most pressingly in 2025. This is a discussion, and we invite each of you to join this discussion. I will be monitoring the chat throughout this conversation, and I invite everyone on this Zoom to please put questions in the chat for our panelists that I can ask. And if you want to join the conversation, to add comments into the chat. In the second half of this conversation, I'll invite others on this call to raise their hands if they want to come into the conversation. We will begin with a few questions of U.S. Canada relations, U.S. Russia relations, and U.S. Nordic relations based on our panelists, and then create a wider space of discussion based on what all of you are interested in. This session is being recorded and will be distributed at the end of this hour if you do need to leave early. And it is part of a longer series that the Arctic Institute will hold throughout 2025 to take stock of headlines and what is not being discussed but should be. So with that, you have heard enough of my voice. So I am going to hand it over to our three panelists today, Gabriella Gricius, Pavel Devyatkin, and Romain Chuffart, and they are going to introduce themselves and what they are thinking about first in 2025 before I come back in and ask them a few pointed questions on policy and power. Roman, I will hand it to you first, and then if you can hand it over to someone else to then introduce themselves and what they're thinking about at the start of 2025.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you for organizing and putting together this event. As you said, my name is Romain Chuffart, and I'm the managing director of the Arctic Institute, and I'm currently zooming in from Akureyri in the north of Iceland, where I work as the Nansen Professor in Arctic Studies. You ask us about our positionality, so I was trained and I work as an international lawyer. I specialize on the rights of indigenous peoples in Arctic governance, also broader questions of international law. So my expertise is very much on international law and the Arctic. I'm not from Iceland, unfortunately. I'm originally from Belgium, and I came to study or to come across Arctic governance around 2015. So it's been a 10-year engagement with questions of governance in the polar regions, most specifically in the Arctic. And so that's me in a nutshell, I guess. Do you also want us to answer straight away of what we want to do, or do you want me to ask someone else?
Why don't we get introductions and then we can get what you are excited and worried about in 2025?
Okay, so I'll pass the mic to Pavel Devyatkin.
Thank you, Romain, and thank you, Victoria. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today for this event. I'm Pavel Devyatkin. I'm an American of Russian ancestry, currently based in Moscow, Russia. I'm a senior associate at the Arctic Institute and a researcher and lecturer at the Higher School of Economics here in Moscow. So my research focuses on Arctic international relations, diplomacy, cooperation, with a focus on Russia's Arctic policy, but also international relations in what could be called the strategic triangle between the U.S., Russia, and China. And I'll hand the mic over to Gabriella for introductions.
Thanks, Pavel. I'm Gabriella Gricius. I'm a research associate at the Arctic Institute. I'm also a PhD candidate at Colorado State University. And my research largely focuses on, broadly speaking, Arctic security. So I look at military security as well as environmental security. And my expertise lies in Svalbard, Greenland, and maritime shipping routes in the Arctic. So I'm currently located in Fort Collins, Colorado, and have been working on the Arctic since around 2020.
Thank you all for positioning yourself in our conversation. And I am going to ask you to position yourself more by letting us into your inner thoughts about the Arctic in 2025. From your perspective, what should we be keeping an eye on as the geopolitical landscape evolves? What has you most worried about 2025 from a polar perspective? And what has you most optimistic in 2025? So give us kind of where you are 2 months into this year.
Those are tough questions, Victoria. Thank you so much. So I think, I mean, I'll try to start with the positive, I guess, because I don't want to put off everyone from the beginning. So what I'm really looking forward to this year in 2025 is a change of chairship of the Arctic Council. Really, so we've all heard about Greenland being in the news, perhaps for the wrong reasons. There's definitely a sense that in 25, Greenland has a growing role in Arctic governance. And as part of the upcoming Danish chairship of the Arctic Council, Greenland is expected to take on a much larger leadership role. And so I think I'm really interested to see how this will bring indigenous perspectives even more to the forefront of Arctic diplomacy and at the core of the Arctic Council, which, I mean, we all see the Arctic Council for better or for worse at the center of the governance web that forms Arctic governance. So I think really this is an opportunity as well for Denmark and Greenland together to really shape the agenda towards a bit more indigenous governance at the Arctic Council level, and perhaps also just take us a bit or decenter us from the great power competition that we've seen play out, at least the narrative we've seen play out in recent months and perhaps even in recent years as well. So that's really, I mean, the chairship will be handed over from Norway to Denmark/Greenland in May. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that happen. And I think something that I'm really also positive about is the work that's being done on the International Polar Year. So all the planning that's being done as part of ICAP for to plan for the International Polar Year in 2032, 2033. So that's really a massive global research initiative and can be, I guess, for lack of a better word, catalyst, I guess, for re-establishing some form of international Arctic cooperation. Although that leads to what I'm, let's say, least optimistic or less optimistic about is really the backseat that science might have, especially given the current U.S. administration and the cut to science fundings that we've seen happen in like what 8 weeks now, 6 weeks. So it's really something that has me worried because, as we know, the core of Arctic governance is really about science and scientific research, much more than perhaps, as I said, great power competition that Gabriella and Pavel can speak a bit better about. And it's really that gets me worried, is this lack of like scientific cooperation that had already happened after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That Russia, I mean, was cut out of scientific collaboration in the Arctic. So we're missing already a big chunk of data from the Russian Arctic. And now we run the risk of having the US exclude itself from scientific collaboration. And I think that's really something that will eventually eventually get us in a less than ideal situation on the governance side, because as I said, what we know is that governance in the Arctic has been historically driven by scientific collaboration. So yeah, balancing the hope and the maybe the opposite here as well. And I'll pass on the mic to Pavel, I guess, this time.
Thanks, Romain. Yeah, I think the biggest trend story that I've been following is, of course, the growing U.S.-Russia rapprochement out of the Putin-Trump phone call, the possible negotiations over Ukraine. There's no bigger topic that's more impactful to the future of the world order. There are updates every day, every hour of new developments in this story. So as of now, everything that we discuss in this Zoom session that you hear will be relevant and up to date, but only until the end of this panel, because something might come up. We know that, for example, Zelensky is planning to come to Washington tomorrow. We'll see if it's confirmed. And today, there was a meeting between Russian and American diplomats in the Consulate General in Istanbul to discuss restoring their diplomatic relations, especially when it comes to their embassies. So I'll start with something that I'm worried about as well. I agree with Romain that very worried about climate change falling to the background, concerns about climate change. We see the climate skeptic administration in Washington. We've seen lots of skeptical trends about climate change in Russia for a long time. And so there's a convergence on this theme. Even in the past administration, in the Biden administration, we saw climate change regarded as a security threat and informing a lot of the security policymaking in Washington. That perspective was not widely accepted in Russia. Russia even vetoed a UN resolution that tried to include climate change in the agenda of the UN Security Council. Allegedly, well, according to Putin's climate change advisor, because Russia didn't want to face sanctions or other consequences due to non-compliance of climate-related goals. And then, so now we're seeing a similar perspective from the Trump administration. I think probably most tragic, we saw Secretary of Defense Hegseth in a recent discussion said, we're getting rid of all the climate BS. So, very tragic to see climate change taking a backseat to discussions of Arctic affairs. But I'm hopeful about cooperation in other areas, cooperation in the Arctic, including in the Arctic Council, but first of all, bilaterally. We're seeing continued rhetoric on cooperation from Russian diplomats and officials. This year, we're going to see the return of the Arctic Territory of Dialogue Forum to Russia. So this is the first time that the Russian government is organizing this forum since 2019. President Putin traditionally takes part in this forum, and lots of people are expecting discussions of U.S.-Russia cooperation, multilateral cooperation. That cooperation will probably mostly be in economic cooperation and in joint ventures. I'll talk more a little bit about that later after what happened from the Saudi Arabia meeting between the foreign minister of Russia and the U.S. Secretary of State. But so we could see a lot of cooperation in economic ventures, perhaps, and I say this neutrally, geological and meteorological cooperation that informs oil and gas ventures. There are also obstacles to cooperation being lifted. So for example, today, the meeting in Istanbul between Russian and American diplomats, they're discussing the restoration of staff to the embassies. So that will make it easier for people to get visas, which has been a main complaint from scientists who take part in the Arctic Council scientific agreement, the agreement on scientific cooperation. So that it should be easier for scientific cooperation to occur. If there's a will for that is still a question, but these are examples of some obstacles being lifted in advance of, for example, what Romain mentioned, the International Polar Year, which will be in 2032, 2033. So I'll stop there. But overall, looking at how U.S.-Russia relations are changing in the Arctic and concerned about climate change not being at the top of the agenda, but staying hopeful when it comes to cooperation in other areas. I'll hand it over to Gabriella.
Thanks, Pavel. So I feel like both of my issue areas were stolen by the other panelists. This is always the issue with going last. I think for me also, the most optimistic thing is very much the Danish chairship. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the increased role of Greenlandic voices there. But I think outside of that, the flip side to seeing the US really taking a step back from its role in climate issues is that it's an opportunity for other states to take a step forward. So I'm looking forward to seeing if European actors and if Canada maybe have an opportunity to take some of that climate leadership in the Arctic. Outside of that, although it's a little old, I think increasing opportunities for interoperability with Finland and Sweden in NATO, I'm optimistic about that. The more time we have to work together, the more opportunities there are to build a stronger alliance with our allies and partners in Europe. But of course, from a negative perspective, the role of the US is very much the stumbling block here. So I think not only is it concerning that the US is taking a step back from funding Arctic research and climate issues, but this also has an impact in how the US will work in the Arctic Council. And we saw this during the last Trump presidency, so I'm concerned about whether we'll see some of that repeated behavior that we saw during the previous Trump administration. And also the extent to which we might see the US turn back to trying to build icebreakers at home. So recently, the US did sign the Ice Pact with Finland and Canada for an opportunity to build multilateral cooperation with allies and building these important vessels. But I think there's some degree to worry whether the current administration will pull back from that agreement and try to build these at home rather than fostering more cooperative approaches. But I will leave it at that and I'll look forward to your for two questions, Victoria.
Yeah, so a lot here, a lot of shared worry about a lack of cooperation, a lack of funding, and some hesitant hope about other leaders stepping into the spotlight and a shift in the Arctic Council. I'll start there because the Arctic Council has for nearly 30 years been this beacon of cooperation. It has had its challenges and its critics. The Arctic Institute publishing among them of how we can improve cooperation and collaboration. But still, it had been this forum where Arctic nation states and Indigenous permanent participants could gather. That obviously did pause with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and has slowly begun to stand up. And as all three of you mentioned, we are on the precipice of a new chairmanship from Norway to Denmark. I'm interested to hear from you how you're thinking about the Arctic Council. What is its relevance today? Is it the same relevance as it had in 2021 before it paused? So what do we think about the power of the Arctic Council in 2025? And going back to what Romain said, this opportunity for real Indigenous leadership in the Arctic Council, will this be realized? I'm sure many participants of this call have noticed that the current U.S. president has made radical statements about taking over Greenland, and that narrative has spooled out without real invitation of the voices of Greenlanders and the Indigenous leadership that is striving for independence in Greenland. So how does this play out as we are T minus 3 months away from this transition? Where are you thinking about Greenland stepping into this leadership, and if it's even relevant?
Thanks, Victoria. Once again, a very, very good question. I think how relevant is the Arctic Council in 2025? I think there's no denying that obviously the Arctic Council is in a precarious position. And as you said, I don't think that's new. I think we can say pretty much since the Icelandic chairship the 2019-2021 chairship, the Arctic Council has really been had a few rocky years. So to say so, we had the COVID pandemic that shifted all of the work of the Arctic Council online during the Icelandic chairship. Then we had the Russian chairship from 2021 to 23. Which brought with it its whole set of really bad things. Just to put it plainly, obviously with Russia's invasion of Ukraine as well, and the actual pose of the council, so the Arctic 7, so that is the 7 Arctic states minus Russia, deciding to effectively pose cooperation. That cooperation has been resuming. I think credit really to Norway, which has had the chairship since 2023, for putting in the work, and also credit to the Arctic Council Secretariat in Tromsø to also do all the behind-the-scene work to make sure that the council wasn't dying and could also deliver the actual crucial work, which is the work of the working group, so the scientific work where the collaboration really is. How relevant is the Arctic Council in 2025? That's a really good question. I think it is perhaps on the science. I think it's perhaps as relevant as ever. even perhaps more relevant given the pressing threats that is brought about by the climate crises. And I think all the data collected by the working group or by the working groups really can really help shape policy making in some Arctic states. And I think that caveat is important. I think what perhaps makes the Arctic Council a bit less relevant is that we have fewer Arctic states being on board with being shaped in their policy by the work of the Arctic Council. And I think that's quite, again, worrisome for the impact, perhaps not the relevance, but the impact the Arctic Council can have on Arctic governance as such. Um, I I do think the Arctic Council still can have some relevance, but perhaps we have to have a more global view of what it means to be relevant. And I think if we think back of the first, let's say, 2 decades of the Arctic Council, where the work of the Arctic Council also helped other governance mechanisms. So when we think of the Minamatta Convention on Mercury, where actually all the data that was created by the Arctic Council helped with the negotiation of that treaty. That's not really, I mean, that's relevant to the Arctic, but that's not only relevant to the Arctic. That helped a global international multilateral environmental agreement there. So I think perhaps we need to distinguish the two, saying that yes, the Arctic Council might lose a tiny bit of relevance in Arctic governance given the current set of events, but it hasn't really lost its relevance in other spheres of governance. And I think, again, credit to the Norwegian chairship there to really push for the Arctic Council to be relevant in other spheres of governance. And to your second question about the role of Greenland, and perhaps this idea that Greenland also can have a bigger role. Perhaps it's quite serendipitous, actually, that Greenland will take over the chair, or Denmark will take over, but de facto, it will be Greenland will take over the chairship of the Arctic Council, because I think this can really put to action Greenlandic foreign policy of nothing about us without us. And I think we have seen the relevance of that, as you said, in recent months, where there's a lot of conversation about Greenland. There's a lot of media articles about Greenland. Not a lot of Greenland politicians or experts being interviewed, or being interviewed at least in U.S. media. So I think just increasing again the relevance of Greenland by it having the chairship of the Arctic Council will do Arctic governance some good, I believe. I think I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to your wonderful thoughts.
Thank you, Romain. Yeah, I do think the Arctic Council will be relevant in 2025. Um, uh, a perfect reason is because of Denmark and Greenland taking over the dynamic in the kingdom and the dynamic between the U.S. and Greenland. It's very important to have a multilateral solution to that issue. But from a Russian perspective, the Arctic Council has been important and continues to be important, even in the aftermath of Trump's proposal to acquire Greenland. Russian diplomats were making statements of shock and awe that they were criticizing the uncertainty, and even Russia's ambassador to Denmark said that he was worried about what this would mean for Denmark's coming Arctic Council chairmanship. So when it comes to the Arctic Council, Russia, as a founding member, still sees value in that multilateral cooperation. And this could even be traced to the origins of the Arctic Council. I've argued that the Arctic Council was born out of Russian political practice, that it was inspired by the speech of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, in 1987. He gave a speech in Murmansk, which was part of his greater new thinking foreign policy about promoting international, universalist, common interests rather than national interests. Gorbachev called for demilitarizing the Arctic, for opening up the Northern Sea route to the international community, and then for establishing an Arctic Research Council, which then went on to form the Arctic Council. So for Russia, the Arctic Council is important for multilateral cooperation. It's been the setting for 3 agreements on search and rescue, marine pollution, and scientific cooperation. And Russia has consistently participated in these agreements and projects in the working groups. And the Arctic Council is also a setting for Russia to meet the United States and other great powers on an equal footing. So after the conflict in Ukraine, we saw Russia withdrawing from the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, but not from the Arctic Council. And that perhaps was because in the Arctic Council, Russia is on an equal footing with the U.S. The U.S. is not a member of the Barents Council. So we could also see how the Arctic Council is important for other states, even in the context of geopolitical tensions. We saw during Norway's chairmanship, Norway hosted the largest military exercise on its territory for NATO troops since the end of the Cold War. Norway imposed very harsh sanctions on Russia. Norway has signed bilateral defense agreements with with the US. But at the same time, Norway, during its chairmanship, has maintained communication channels with the US, with Russia in Coast Guard cooperation, in managing the land border. Norway has not closed the land border with Russia, while Finland and the Baltic states have. But then specifically in the Arctic Council, we saw Norway's senior Arctic official, Morten Høglund, restarting virtual meetings with participants from the Russian Federation. So at first, representatives of the indigenous peoples, and then slowly other members from Russia. So the Arctic Council can be a setting for communication when other communication channels are cut off. And just to go back to what I said at the beginning, that the Arctic Council was born out of the political conditions of the Cold War. It succeeded the Cold War, and we're seeing a real decline in West-Russia relations right now. And so the Arctic Council could prove to be another setting for communication and cooperation between Russia and the West, in addition to a slew of other areas, perhaps arms control, energy security, Middle East stability. So the Arctic Council can be something as a tool for rapprochement. So overall, I do think the Arctic Council is relevant. And I'll just mention about Greenland that I agree with Romain that it's very important to include Greenlanders in deciding the future of Greenland. The U.S. doesn't need to own Greenland to achieve its own security interests or economic interests in the Arctic, and even Trump's efforts to try to acquire Greenland seem counterproductive when it comes to relations with U.S. allies. So when Greenland will be at the top of the agenda in the from May onward, in the chairmanship, it'll be very important to draw attention to involving Greenlanders in decision making. As I understand that Denmark and Greenland agreed that Greenland would be the first to speak at Arctic Council meetings and would be the main signatory for any declarations that involved Greenland and Denmark. But we'll see how that develops. So thank you, and I'll pass the mic over to Gabriella.
Yeah, thank you, Pavel. I would certainly echo both Pavel and Romain that the Arctic Council, I believe, is still extremely relevant today. From a scientific sense, I think not only is it important in terms of the work of the working groups, but we need to have a good understanding about how climate change is changing the Arctic in important ways. And the reports that the working groups put out are really essential to this. And so continuing that work, I think, is of utmost importance. But beyond that, the work of the Arctic Council Secretariat in going to key climate conferences and presenting that work, I think also is a really important international role that the Arctic Council can take in portraying what's going on in the region to other audiences. From a political role, I also very much agree with Pavel that it's an important space for the US and Russia to meet in an area that is not nearly as politicized as other parts of the globe might be. And I think here also, beyond just state to state level, people to people relations matter a lot here. So building those longstanding diplomatic relationships, not only between top diplomats, but also staff members, who might have known each other for a long time, pre-2014 even, and restarting those type of relationships, I think, can be an important place in which the Arctic Council can play a role. Regarding Greenland, yes, so Greenland needs to play a central role in Arctic decision making. And as Roma mentioned, since Trump's recent comments, there's been this tendency to really treat Greenland as merely a object about which we talk about and not including Greenlanders' voice at all. So placing them as the central character in their own future continues to be really important.
Thank you all. And we at the Arctic Institute will have a webinar coming up specifically on the Arctic Council chairmanship and on Greenland with some of our Greenlandic and Danish colleagues and friends. So please stay tuned for a more robust conversation on that. I'm going to shift over to the economic landscape of cooperation and power dynamics in the Arctic for this next question before opening it up to our attendees for any questions you might have. Because both Pavel and Gabby, you brought up extraction, brought up shipping, this potential end worry in 2025 for what comes next when the United States is deprioritizing climate change. And there is discussions happening in Moscow, in DC, but also in the Middle East on new collaboration, partnerships, and deals on energy and on shipping, right? These two potential areas for economic cooperation have just in the last 2 days have come out of these discussions between Russia and the United States and countries in the Gulf. So I'd love to hear from you, Gabby and Pavel, a little bit more about where we are in 2025 with energy and extraction and the geopolitical landscape, and in shipping. How do these how are these both areas that we should keep an eye on for the better and for the worse? What should we be looking out for? Gabby, maybe you can start us off on this one.
Sure. So I think about these from a couple different angles. I think, as you mentioned, from a diplomatic perspective, leaving out any possible environmental issues, to me, this is a really good sign because when two states that are previously pretty aggressive towards one another can work together on projects, that's a positive in terms of decreasing militarization in the region. And I think about this through like a relatively small optimistic light where, if the US and Russia can cooperate on energy oil extraction projects, that not only has downstream impacts for lower militarization, but also the possibility that now Russia can operate extractive projects in a better technological standpoint than they otherwise might be able to do themselves. That's necessarily good. Obviously, from an environmental perspective, it comes with risks to increase extractive practices in the Arctic, and so that's concerning in general. But I think we also need to pay attention to the role of Indigenous perspectives. And I don't want to, by any means, essentialize all Indigenous communities. There are big differences in how communities think about extraction and shipping near to where they live. But incorporating those voices will be a really important next stage if the US and Russia do continue on those projects. In terms of shipping, it obviously depends on the shipping route you're talking about, of course. So the Northwest Passage, I think, is in no way going forward in shipping in the same way that the Northern Sea Route is. And Pavel can obviously speak in much more depth about that. But I think, there's a good case to be made for how really paying attention to how Northern Sea Route shipping will evolve in the future, how we're going to understand whether the Northern Sea Route is internal waters or an international strait, and really dealing with a lot of those legal ambiguities before that strait becomes more really prominently used outside of Russia.
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, just on U.S.-Russia relations in energy, we saw the talks in Saudi Arabia bring about real optimism from businessmen, from people, from analysts, financial analysts, looking at opportunities for energy, joint investment. Kirill Dmitriev, the CEO of Russia's Direct Investment Fund, was part of the Russian delegation to the meeting in Riyadh, and he specifically named the Arctic as a potential setting for U.S.-Russia cooperation. He told Russian media that Russia proposed collaboration in economic projects, and at the same time, there are a lot of discussions from the U.S. side about potential for economic cooperation with Russia. There's a rumor, it's reported in Russian media, I haven't yet seen it in English language media, that the US has sent Russia a request to approve a new US ambassador to Moscow. And the proposed ambassador is someone named Richard Norland, who was the US senior Arctic official in the 90s. So Norland's an accomplished diplomat, already worked in Moscow during the Cold War. He also worked in Tromsø in northern Norway. So his experience in these positions, and especially as an Arctic expert, signal that there's a real potential for U.S.-Russia cooperation in the Arctic. And it's most likely going to mostly be in energy relations because of the priorities of the two sides. The ambassador's approval is to be confirmed, even the idea is to be confirmed, but it was reported in one authoritative Russian newspaper. In terms of energy projects in general, most of Russia's Arctic oil and gas projects are in the Arctic, and gas projects especially concentrated in one region in the Yamal Peninsula. A lot of the new projects have been sanctioned. So there was one project called Vostok Oil, which was planned for to be initiated in 2024, but production has been delayed to 2026 because of sanctions on technology transfer. But there are many big projects like this. So Vostok Oil aims to reach about 100 million tons of oil per year by 2033. And this will definitely contribute to traffic on the Northern Sea route because the main source of traffic along the Northern Sea route is transfer of these extracted resources. So we are seeing Russian agencies like Rosatom expanding its port infrastructure, services to ships to be able to improve the safety of navigating the Northern Sea route. putting out satellites to better understand the weather conditions in the region. Russia's constructing new icebreakers. So we're seeing lots of new developments in terms of energy extraction, and that will definitely contribute to Northern Sea Route shipping. The plan to reach 80 million tons of shipping along the Northern Sea Route by 2025 or 2024 was not reached. It was rather around, I think, 39 million tons. So there have been problems with achieving the goals of shipping along the Northern Sea Route related to sanctions on shipping, and then follow-up sanctions on the shadow fleets of Russia. We're seeing Russia pivot more to working with China, but even then, China's state-backed shipping company, COSCO, the China Overseas Shipping Company, paused its shipping along the Northern Sea Route in 2022. We saw a different company, the New Shipping Line, take over, but still the large objectives for achieving a polar Silk Road are still questionable. But at the same time, we're seeing lots of high-level meetings between Arctic diplomats from Russia, senior officials in China, big deals being made, memoranda of understanding. We're seeing lots of very hefty goals being set. So the Sino-Russian relationship will definitely develop, and the Arctic will be a region of priority for Russia and China. But it's still being debated about the viability of the Northern Sea Route in the short term. There is still not really favorable ice conditions, sea ice conditions. Icebreakers are still needed, and the port infrastructure is still underdeveloped. But I believe the authorities are well aware of this and developing this, and it's still is regarded as a strategic priority to develop the Northern Sea Route. And because of Russia's dependence on oil and gas, which runs through the Arctic, we'll still see that develop very much.
So as we are heading into our final minutes of our hour together, time flies when you're talking Arctic geopolitics. I'm going to pick up on your last comment, Pavel, on China in the Arctic to bring a question from one of our attendees on China and indigenous relations for Arctic geopolitics. So Philip has put in the chat that in Canada, for a good decade, nearly all of Nunavut's economy was based on exporting iron ore to China. That was then cut off in 2017. And he is asking about the impact of China's investment or lack thereof for Nunavut, but maybe more broadly, the economy of the Arctic. What does it mean to think about Chinese investment and its position in extractive industries across the region? And maybe in that, how do you think about security and specifically indigenous security as China is in some places stepping into the Arctic economy, and in others really stepping back, not just in Nunavut, but Pavel, as you said, with shipping too. So open to anyone taking this kind of China in the Arctic in 2025, and specifically indigenous relations and the Arctic economy.
I'm happy to just, oh, Roma, you also unmuted. Okay. I can't really speak to Nunavut specifically, but I think you're absolutely right that China really was pushing forward in around 2018 for really being engaged in smaller states in the Arctic. But since COVID has really pulled back from a lot of Arctic engagement, and I think in North America, in particular in Canada, there's been a lot of concern about Chinese investment in Indigenous communities, particularly regarding hybrid threats and societal security. The extent to which, we see this across the Arctic is a little unclear, particularly because in many of the projects in Northern Europe that China has attempted to invest in, they've gotten a lot of pushback from countries in Northern Europe as well. So I think, looking forward, we should absolutely pay attention to China's role in the Arctic. But as one of our colleagues says, China is not a pure competitor, either in a security sense or in an economic sense. So I think keeping those things in mind, so not necessarily fully freezing China out, because of course it has a right as a state to be involved in the Arctic if it wishes, but just being cognizant about the risks that come with it.
Yeah, just to follow on what you said, Gabriella, I think also we need to make sure that those activities, wherever they happen in the Arctic, needs to be done with the fulfillment of indigenous rights as well. So not only the dual security threat, but also the threat to traditional livelihood and especially rights of indigenous peoples as well. It's not because it's foreign actors that other rules apply to them as well. So I think it's also the burden then falls on Arctic states in that regard to oversee what happens in their own Arctic, and to really see that licensing is being done according to current legislations and also according to current state obligations towards indigenous rights. And I think that's really important as well. I can less talk to the economic side because I'm not an economist, but it's something at least from a rights-based approach and from an international legal approach as well, that we need to make sure that those investments are not being done in a manner that doesn't respect the rights of indigenous peoples in the region as well.
And maybe as a concluding question on the hour, Pavel, if I can get your voice on this from Mark, asking specifically about China's response of these warming relations between the United States and Russia. Is this a point of contention between the US and Russia, or the US and China, or a point of contention between Russia and China? Kind of what is this triangle of relations from your perspective?
Yeah, I would just say that the official stance of China on the Arctic is that the region is an area of common heritage for humankind. So officials and diplomats have a very multilateral perspective on the Arctic. So I don't think officially you're going to get any kind of desire from Chinese diplomats or officials about wanting to split apart the U.S. and Russia. We are seeing that from the U.S. We see that Trump specifically saying he wants to split Russia from China, trying to do something like what Nixon did during the Cold War, the strategic triangle, with Kissinger's strategy to split the USSR from China. But then businessmen are perhaps going to be suspicious or cautious about Chinese interests in the Russian Arctic if, for example, we're seeing just this week, Putin announced how Russia would like to open up the minerals and rare earth metals in Russia to U.S. investment and joint exploration. So that might make the window smaller for Chinese business interests in China, in the Arctic.
Thank you, Pavel, and thank you, Gabby and Roman, for this really inspired and critical conversation. We only scratched the surface of geopolitics in the Arctic in 2025, and know that each of you have so much more to share, to discuss, to dive deeper into these questions on the Arctic Council, on climate change, Russia, China indigenous sovereignty. And the Arctic Institute will endeavor to have those conversations throughout 2025. This is just the first of a monthly series where we will have these conversations with people across the field to take stock on what is and is not happening in the region. And we invite each of you to join us monthly in these conversations. We will be sending the recording of this out to everyone after this, and an invitation. If you yourself are an Arctic scholar, stakeholder, or speaker, we invite you to sign up with a topic that you are knowledgeable about to join the roundtable in future months to have these discussions and to create spaces for conversations on critical issues. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today, for taking an hour of your time to discuss Arctic affairs. A huge virtual round of applause to Romain, to Gabby, and to Pavel for their expertise and their experience. And we hope to see you at our next Arctic convening in March. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone.